Hello, welcome again to Sport Unlocked with all the week's sports news with me, Rob Harris from Sky News, Martyn Ziegler from The Times, Tariq Panja from The New York Times. And as ever, if you hit subscribe, we land in your feeds automatically. And so many of you are listening around the world, looking at some of the charts. Top 20 in Romania, Singapore, Uruguay, also top 100 in Saudi, knows Apple Sports Pod charts. People are certainly tuning in for the insights, thankfully.
And hello to my friend in Brunei Dar es Salaam.
Is that a loyal listener, Tariq, from Brunei?
He is. And hopefully we will one day be able to unpack some of the issues happening in different corners of the world, including Brunei one day.
Huge interest, it was seen particularly from the recent episodes in finding out what's happening inside the world of FIFA beyond all those official statements, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things. FIFA, the governing body of 211 football associations around the world, and as Gianni Infantino says, football unites the world. I think what we're seeing from at least from some of the listeners is they'd like to see a little bit more about what's happening. Then hopefully we're able to deliver some of that on this pod.
Yeah, something we hear quite often from in and around FIFA. Why are we talking about them so often? But there is global interest in them and global interest in knowing how things are run, and so much more to get to as well on that as we go through this week's episode. But a slightly unusual recording time of this week's episode, because as we're doing it in Las Vegas, the Formula One practice session is still going on, but going on in the middle of the night.
So it's something like 2:30 in the morning, Las Vegas time, and yet they are practicing on this new circuit. I think they spent something like $700 million to bring F1 to back to Las Vegas, and for what is essentially a dead race because everything's been decided. And then the whole practice session was disrupted because one of the cars hit a manhole cover. Everything had to be suspended. Something like 400 manhole covers on the rest of the circuit all had to be checked. And then, it's a disastrous start.
Well, not just one car. A little while later, another car hit the same manhole. So we've had two cars affected by this manhole, which has become at least a trivial pursuit question for years to come. What caused the suspension of one of the most expensive Formula One races in history, at least the practice session? And it's this manhole. And as we're recording this, guys, the grandstand Las Vegas, across, with those hotels with neon lights and all the rest of it, that great backdrop, if you're into that sort of thing, are empty because, as you say, it's the middle of the night or early morning now, and probably not the start they were expecting.
And some of the roads have to open up to the locals, I think, from 4 a.m. Max Verstappen, of course, has already wrapped up the title, had already said ahead of practice that the race seems to be 99% show, 1% sporting event, and said he felt like a clown standing on the stage during one of the opening ceremonies as the music acts were going on. But doesn't F1 need some of this glitz and glamour and entertainment, particularly when the season's already been sorted with a few races to go?
Well, you'd have thought so, but to try and generate some interest. I mean, Max Verstappen didn't even turn up. He sort of boycotted one of the launch events that he was supposed to go to. He just didn't bother going. Which, you think how much money he earns from the sport, you could at least sort of make a bit of an effort.
Yes, there's that tension as a sport, as entertainment, and the way it has grown this audience in the United States in particular is off the back of the Netflix documentary series Drive to Survive, which is entertainment as much as it is sport. It's put these personalities, or some that aren't particular personalities. I don't think Max Verstappen wants to consider himself as a personality, more a driver. But this interest is from really that show, and you can't. I guess you're trying to bite the hand that feeds you if you're that sport. Rob, the ticket prices is something they caught my eye. In the resale market, they've absolutely plummeted. The interest that there was expected to be there just hasn't really materialized. And one of the factors is Max Verstappen's dominance. It's like, you're going there for a dead race weekend. Is that going to be a challenge moving forward for Formula One?
Some of the grandstand tickets for the weekend cost £2,000.
That's a lot. Some people might pay that sort of money, not have to sort of endure that.
On the flip side, if you go to Formula E, you're missing that noise. It sounds curiously quiet.
Yeah. I think some people actually love the noise. I'm just being facetious, obviously, but it did make me think. Actually, if you live next door to this the track in Vegas, and they're practicing at 2:30 in the morning, you might not be very happy.
No, but I doubt there's that many people who I don't know Vegas that well, but it seems to be around those 24-hour casino hotels. So I assume quite a few people might be up at that time of the night in Las Vegas.
Although some people might be getting more realistic insight into summer Vegas, because away from those glamorous skyscrapers, you do see some of the more normal streets, some of the more regular shops, which show the perhaps less wealthy part of Vegas as well in shots.
Yeah. I mean, it's just quite a peculiar situation, isn't it? All of it. This whole Las Vegas Grand Prix. I mean, we started this with this snafu over the training, over these training runs, and don't forget this is the first race that is being completely organised by Liberty Media, the majority owner. That's the other new development in Las Vegas. The company that owns Formula One, the company owns the management of this race as well. So perhaps a little bit of an unfortunate start for them. That said, who knows? We might get a very exciting next 3 days, and we're talking about it next week. It might be a completely different conversation, but right now it's it can only get better.
Yeah, the whole debate around the race, all the issues raised by Verstappen and talking about problems over the whole running of the event, it being too much of a showbiz event, it created some headlines. And sometimes a sport event does need a sort of controversy to attract some interest, particularly when, in F1's case, Verstappen won the title in the first week of October. So, we're 6-7 weeks on from that. So that's effectively wrapped up the season. And sometimes a sports event can benefit from a bit of public debate and controversy. We've seen at the Cricket World Cup with discussion over the pitch used for India's semi-final, although, of course, if you're the opposition, then you're not particularly happy, perhaps, if you had a pitch change. But, a sports event that might not be in the headlines, gets itself a bit of headlines, might produce bigger figures in terms of viewing. Although now, with the viewing being delayed, it's a slight issue.
Yeah, as long as it doesn't affect the outcome of the sport. I think in one case you're right. So it's better to be talked about than not talked about. That said, if you're going to change the actual field of play and give one team or one whatever the advantage you can give someone in Formula One is, and changes the potentially changes the outcome of the sport, then that's probably not a good thing. You don't want to be talked about for creating a scenario that will give someone an advantage and to win a game potentially.
No, but you're right. F1 really does need something to change actually on the track, because it's just been a procession for the last 2 years, and they need some proper competition, because that really is what drives interest. So I am sure that they'll be desperately hoping that the teams can come up with more competitive cars.
Maybe they're needing Florentino Perez to run things. He certainly seems to have the grand vision in terms of how football should be running, and repeating it again in the last week, the Real Madrid president at the club's AGM, remember the Super League? Well, he's still saying it's needed more than ever.
Yeah, I mean, no one's surprised on that. We're going to find out, aren't we, on December the 21st, what the European Court of Justice says about the Super League. But it's a sort of fairly repetitive refrain from Florentino Perez at the moment. Interesting financial figures coming out from Real Madrid. They've cut their wage bill quite significantly, quite a way below Barcelona's now, actually, for last season. So, maybe he's feeling that they're having to kind of cut their cloth, and he's a bit unhappy about that.
That said, Real Madrid, in terms of wages, have always been, in recent times at least, have always been quite conservative, broadly, considering the size of the club and considering what Barcelona spent. Barcelona, of course, in massive financial disarray because of all of that spending on salaries. In that context, I would say not that they spend little, but Real Madrid have been quite restrained broadly, and the way they've selected players as well. For example, getting very young, talented players in Brazil with like Vinicius and Rodrigo when they did, and then obviously that type of price wasn't available when they signed Jude Bellingham, of course, but he's turned out to be a very astute signing, someone in just turned 20. You can get many years out of Jude Bellingham. They've been a bit smarter. What he's talking at a point, again, when we're seeing television rights in markets like France and Italy struggle again, the long-term vision for clubs that are not, certainly not in the Premier League in England, and maybe not the one or two top ones. It is quite destabilizing, I suppose. Do you agree that with what he's saying, that the people, like the Champions League is going to be boring from here on in?
Well, we don't really know, because there's going to be a new Champions League format from next September. So I think it's fair to say that the Champions League group stage, as it is and has been for the last few years, isn't the most exciting in most people's eyes. But it's going to be all new, this Swiss model, which I think should breathe some new life into it. Be interesting to see how it takes off. I think it's definitely going to be better. But yeah, we'll see what Mr. Perez makes of it.
Well, Perez saying that without innovation, without modernisation, without transparency, without bringing the competition close to fans, that's how UEFA's been effectively running things for 30 years. So maybe be more suited in the world of Formula One as they try to shake things up and maybe play the Champions League in the middle of the night.
That's a good idea, Rob.
Now, you're mentioning wages there. How justified is it to focus on a club's wages? Something that's come into sharp focus with another club reporting its finances.
Oh, yes. It's funny, I didn't even mention Real Madrid's revenues because I don't even know what they are. I haven't actually been particularly interested in what their total revenue is. But yeah, Manchester City announced its financial figures for 2022-23 this season. And that was when they won the treble, of course, the Premier League, FA Cup and the Champions League. And yes, record everything. Record revenues for an English club, 713 million. Record wages paid by an English club, 423 million. First time it's been over 400 million. And record profits from Manchester City, I think about 80 million, which is the most they've ever made.
Yeah, it's a very, very big day, that announcement. You forgot to mention one thing: record number of charges issued by a Premier League to a Premier League club. 115 charges Manchester City face for a number of breaches, essentially cheating the financial fair play system that is in England. And it's very difficult talking about Manchester City without that issue being resolved, I find. Just to be clear, it could be any team, whether it's Chelsea or Everton, which we can get on to. But the core issue of Manchester City and its finances are always going to be difficult to discuss. And say, well done to Manchester City for doing so well on the field and here off the field with these record numbers of revenues. And they also announced a profit, I think, of £80 million, which is very difficult to do in football. So well done to them. But it's very difficult to have that kind of celebrated, I suppose, in the way they would want it to, and the way most people would, with this issue that is now in its fifth year unresolved, guys.
And the financial report did include the paragraph saying that in February 2023, in response to the charges, this club issued a public statement that it welcomes the review of this matter by an independent commission to impartially consider the comprehensive body of irrefutable evidence that exists in support of its position. That's how they reference the 115 charges in their annual report. But certainly, you can't talk about the club finances without this huge case, because the case relates to how they grew revenue at the club.
Yeah, and a lot of their revenues are commercial income, and obviously a lot of their sponsorship income is for companies associated with the Abu Dhabi owners. So that's one of the reasons why the Premier League has brought in this fair market value assessment that all associated party deals have to be basically assessed by an independent person or independent panel or company to make sure that they're not sort of being paid beyond what the market value would be.
And some of the allegations in those Football Leaks documents were that Abu Dhabi entities were repaying the sponsors in some form in money that was filtering around Abu Dhabi.
Yeah, these inflated sponsorship levels, guys. But and look, they could say that was then, even though they won't say that because they deny it, and it's all irrefutable evidence, all the rest of it. But this was stuff in the past. Now. Manchester City is a winning machine, winning 4 of the last 5 Premier Leagues, finally winning the Champions League last season. It is, by many measures, the best football team in the world when it comes to performance on the pitch. So this revenue today might be justified. So why doesn't everyone just look forward? But I guess that's not how it works, is it? If all of this has been built on alleged subterfuge and bending or breaking of rules, then the whole edifice has to be questioned, right? And what Man City is today, unfortunately, stands in a different light. If these 115 charges that the Premier League have brought are confirmed by this independent panel, and as you said, they can't wait for this to be done. You mentioned that report, Rob. Pep Guardiola said he'd like it to be done tomorrow or something a few months ago when he gave. So why is it taking so long if they want it to be done so fast?
And wasn't the issue with how they were stalling the case at one point?
Well, the whole way through, they've sort of tried to stall the case. I mean, that came out in the High Court during the investigation, didn't it? That they were effectively putting every sort of legal obstacle and challenge that the club could, or that certainly their lawyers were. So I think that's I think that's a bit of an issue. Just on not just a Manchester City thing, but a sort of broader thing around sort of commercial income. So I think it is a good move bringing in this sort of associated party assessment for the Premier League, but for not just Manchester City, but any club which is state-owned or has for example, Newcastle, the Saudi PIF, or has a sort of huge amount of money behind them, like Roman Abramovich during his Chelsea time, and with a sort of web of business interests. There are sort of issues around. So you can make sure that all your sponsorship deals are fair market value, but actually there is no limit to the number of smaller deals you can have. So you could have 100 different companies all paying fair market value to be sort of smaller sponsors, and you can just get loads and loads and loads of these.
Well, but Chelsea is another example. Their current shirt sponsor, Infinite Athlete, I think required that sort of check as well, because it's linked to at least part of the ownership. But to the point, it's worth asking the Premier League, and I don't know the answer to this, Martyn, but if you're going to be doing 100 sponsors, say, or 1,000 sponsors, if you're the 99th or the 100th sponsor or the 999th, surely the market value of being the 999th isn't the same as being the 8th. Do you know what I mean? It's diminishing returns at that point. So maybe they'll measure that as well. You've got so many sponsors that this one's actually worth 50p, guys. So maybe that's how they do it. But again, it's about transparency, and maybe for the Premier League to put someone up and talk about how all of this works.
You couldn't fit 100 sponsors on a backdrop.
You'll need a very small magnifying glass, I suppose, to get them all. I've seen some sort of artist works with many, many different labels on them. So maybe you could do it like that.
Do you remember those online advertising things? I don't know if it was about a decade ago where you bought a pixel on a page. I can't remember what happened.
It's going to be like
£1 million pixel.
But I'm sure there's clubs have sponsors which don't appear on backdrops because they're just not big enough, aren't they? There's lots of those already.
Now, you mentioned Chelsea there in relation to the Manchester City case. Now, this City period covers a leadership that's all still in place, the same ownership, many of the same executives and people behind the scenes. Separately, we have an ongoing Chelsea case, which intriguingly relates to the Roman Abramovich era. Now we're in the Clear Lake Todd Bowley era, and they have this investigation hanging over them. And more details emerged this time from the Cyprus papers, which The Guardian and BBC Newsnight are amongst those, to obtain information about Roman Abramovich. And it alleges various side payments that are alleged to agents.
Well, yeah, not just to agents, but a couple of agents. One is to Eden Hazard's agent. This was a payment made after Hazard moved to Chelsea some months afterwards, which I think the leaked contract says is for sort of scouting services. And then there's another Italian agent who is not Antonio Conte's agent, but has worked closely with him. So, and it just happened a payment was made to his from an Abramovich company to this guy's reportedly an American company for $10 million on the day Conte signed a contract extension. Whether it's connected or not, Mr. Pastorello, his representative, declined to comment, but they said everything is above board.
Arsene Wenger, at the time Arsenal manager in 2014, related to how he'd hoped to sign Eden Hazard and said, "I wanted to take him. I had his agent at my home. But again, the barrier was financial and Chelsea made an effort that I couldn't make."
Yeah, well, he couldn't make that. Not the only player who was destined somewhere else. Willian, I think, was at the Tottenham training ground at one point, or was on his way to Tottenham's offices, and he ended up signing for Chelsea as well. Look, all of this taken in its totality, though, we've talked about Manchester City and what a scandal it would be if they're guilty of this, given how much they've won. Let's not forget that period that Roman Abramovich and Chelsea were very, very dominant. It's essentially different ways of breaking the rules, but again, getting rid of that level playing field, doing things that you can do and other teams cannot do to get success. Like, in short, cheating. We hear the new owners, the statements from the new owners saying, if anything had been done, this was under a previous ownership. However, the record, as with Man City, will be that this team won the Premier League in that era, and if they are found guilty, it's a serious breach of the rules, right? And if you're a fan of another team or a team that was competing for the league or for that last Champions League spot, whatever it was, it's had a huge effect on your past and your present and possibly your future.
And no word from Roman Abramovich or his lawyers, according to those who conducted the investigative reporting.
No, I've emailed Roman Abramovich is one of his representatives in Russia. No response. But you're right, Tariq. It's really, really serious. And the interesting question is, should there be any mitigation if this is all found proven? And let's remember this: a lot of this stuff has been self-reported by the new owners. What sort of mitigation should it be for the new owners having fronted up about this? I think they were forced to front up about it. By the way, I think legally they had to, but I think it's an interesting one. Do you take like really severe actions? I mean, because this sort of thing should be huge points deductions or even sort of relegation. This sorts of things, in my view.
Well, we have to see how much they've fronted up. We don't know if all of this is exactly the scale of all of this is what they fronted up to. Yes, Martyn, you're right. They did front up to some of this because we've talked about some of this in the past, I believe, but not all of this.
No, the Hazard thing we didn't know before, but obviously we did know about Willian and Samuel Eto'o because I reported on that a few weeks ago.
Conte's alleged contract, we didn't know. I mean, there could be even more. Like, let's be honest, this has only come out because these Cyprus papers leaks, these financial details have leaked from Cyprus.
All led by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. So you'd even get rival clubs, fans saying, why was none of this exposed maybe when Chelsea were winning the titles while Abramovich was still there? obviously what is being alleged. But of course, these things are hard to come by. Like with the Manchester City case, it's from behind the scenes documentation that isn't in the public domain being obtained that helped to sort of allegedly shed a light on how money was flowing around.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about whether new owners, if a club's under new ownership, does that make any difference to the penalty? Should that make any difference to any sanction?
Why should it? Because if you look at the competitions, a sporting competition, not a competition of owners. So what happened on the field? What can they do as well? I mean, we haven't talked about mitigation against what? Like, what could the penalties be? And then we can talk about what kind of mitigation for new owners and the like. Because if it was the current owner, he'd be thrown out. So at least they're not going to be thrown out. So there's some mitigation there. What about, I don't know, what are the penalties that Chelsea could face here if found guilty of these allegations?
Well, you allude to one there, which is barring people being directors, points deductions, expulsion from the league, stripping titles. And the question is, which would be deemed the most effective punishments in any case if there was to be anything proven against them? What would satisfy rival clubs, rival fans? Would it be retrospective, symbolic stripping of titles that would cast a doubt over that era? Would it be ensuring the team suffers now? Or would it be financial penalties that were somehow redistributed to those teams who missed out?
Well, I think this sort of thing would be so serious that if you look at what, in the EFL, we've had the sort of points deductions we've had just for breaching financial fair play, then it would have to be something massive like 30, 40 point deduction or relegation, expulsion from the league, because in this sort of scheme of things, that would be the only sort of thing that would be comparable.
Well, we've seen partly how little the penalty can be with what UEFA did. I think UEFA fined Chelsea €10 million, and everyone can move on now. Is that related to some of this, or is that something else?
That is related to a small amount of this, because that they could only deal with 1 year, 2017, basically,
because of the time limits.
Yeah, the time bars.
Okay. So then I've got a question.
The Premier League can go back to whenever they want.
Yeah.
The time limit's been brilliant. Just keep it hidden for a few years, and then you get away with it.
Well, then I've got another question for you guys. It's like, would you say that the people who are supposed to be looking at this stuff, whether it's the Premier League or whether it's UEFA or whoever, FAs in different countries, do you think they have the will to actually dig into this stuff properly? Because as Rob alluded to earlier, most of the biggest cases have come through investigative journalism or some sort of leak. Nothing from the governing bodies doing the investigations. We have no real transparency over what happens in those investigations, or the outcomes, or how they derive the number of, the penalties, the fine, or whatever it is. Do you think they really want to do it, or do you think obviously they want the show to go on? You don't want to kick out big teams. You don't want to embarrass your competition. So probably light touch. Is that fair?
I think in the past, absolutely, there was a reluctance in the Premier League to tackle these sorts of things, because I think there's a pragmatic approach. Certainly, probably when Richard Scudamore was there, that I think his priority was getting the best players in the world to the Premier League, and he probably wasn't that sort of keen on embarking on huge investigations into the league's members. I think that's probably changed, and I think it's no coincidence that we've had new chairwoman of the Premier League come in, new chief executive in the last few years, and I think that there is, and also I think there are other clubs are pushing hard for more rigorous investigations too, because they see the sort of the leaks and the reports, and I think they think that action needs to be taken. So I think a combination of factors means that there is now more appetite for taking on this sort of thing.
Well, it's certainly a case that has many levels of complexity, and also rival clubs who might well want to see action taken against one of their fellow members of the Premier League.
Yeah, those are the ones we know about, and and we've got this issue of this independent regulator. I saw some politicians talking about the current Chelsea allegations, saying perhaps the Premier League and FFP should be taken out of the Premier League's purview and put into a separate body that regulates the competition. To be honest with you, looking at what's happened and what's been happening, it's not the worst idea. Let the Premier League get on with running the competition, its games, its organisation, selling broadcast contracts and all the rest. But why not someone else in charge of enforcement and policing the competition? Who knows?
And it's all about how you govern yourself. And we had a completely separate incident case this week at the Football Association, which placed itself in quite a challenging situation after one of its council members, Wazim Haq, on Saturday, amid widespread pro-Palestinian protests around, tweeted that Adolf Hitler would be proud of Benjamin Netanyahu. And Wazim Haq is not only a council member at the FA, the Lawn Tennis Association, also with Golf England as well. And then it sort of put the FA into a sort of position about what it does about this.
What did they do?
Well, it was one of those situations where you get evolving statements. First of all, them saying he apologised, which he hadn't done publicly. He then, sort of several hours later on the Sunday, did post a long public apology, which was saying he didn't mean to cause offence, denying being anti-Semitic, and also defending the comparison. And why this comparison was particularly highlighted is the reference to Hitler and Netanyahu is seen as a potential breach of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which the FA adopted, which calls against using the language of Nazis, distancing themselves from it. They put their own statement out as well, saying they're investigating. Then the FA on Sunday night, a few hours later, updated their original statement to say they were investigating. Then on the Monday, the Lawn Tennis Association said they remove him from his council, from its council. Then on the Tuesday, the FA announced that he'd been suspended from the council. So we've got the LTA removing him from the council, the FA suspending him from the council pending a formal investigation. And as we see perhaps with FIFA council members in particular as well, these aren't staff members of these institutions. So it creates a situation in terms of how you deal, how you manage what people can and what they have the right to say.
Yeah, I mean, he's not a. I mean, I think there's like 100 FA councillors, aren't there? He's not a sort of someone who's actually in day-to-day control of anything the FA does. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a sort of salutary lesson that anybody in a sort of responsible position in sport doesn't use the word Hitler on social media. I think that's a sort of the bottom line. Interesting, actually, Wazim Haq. He was also the guy. He was on the Essex Cricket Club's board at one point, and he was the person who sort of blew the whistle on the chairman allegedly using racist language, which the chairman just denied. But I think it was, it was a sort of fairly controversial case in Essex, and as it all came out as part of the racism in cricket investigation.
Yeah, and the sad thing is things like this undermine whatever's happened before, right? You'll obviously have people saying, well, look at this guy, if he's going to do that. And it's the nature of things. But just to draw a line under this, Ziggs, absolutely right. Can everyone stop mentioning Hitler? There is no good that's going to come from using the word Hitler, is there? So yeah, a lesson there.
And for Wazim Haq, it's one of those issues about, particularly in this current climate around the Israel-Hamas war, what can and should be said online. And if you are in any form of position of leadership in sport, and Wazim Haq was particularly the BAME representative on the council, so with responsibility for diversity and minority ethnic issues, if as a public sports leader, you actually need to refrain from commenting on things that aren't directly related to your brief, or should there be absolute freedom of speech?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously one that affects within and across the media as well, and certainly not one only sport has had to grapple with politicians in terms of the language used as well. In this week, we've had both Israel and Palestine's teams resuming their qualification matches. Israel for the Euros, Palestine for the World Cup, with the Palestinians saying some of their players have been unable to leave Gaza. And then amidst it all, as we've seen in the past with COVID, particularly those domestic leagues, even with wars going on, it comes back to issues about when do you get leagues back up and running, how do you resolve leagues, and things like qualifications. Some of those normal football issues do end up coming back into play again.
Yeah, seen that in Ukraine as well, haven't we? This sort of effort to try and keep sport going in the face of the sort of most terrible events that are happening. It's amazing people even want to do it, I think.
Probably all ends up showing how much sport matters to people, even in the most difficult circumstances, because it will be the escapism, even whatever situation you're in.
Yeah, no, I think escapism is the right phrase for it. And I think even actually, if you're going back to the Second World War and the First World War, there were certainly, both in Nazi Germany and in England, there were sort of demonstration sports matches, weren't they? Seen as a sort of good way of boosting morale. So I think it's, even in the most testing circumstances, sport keeps going.
We do end up getting into a philosophical debate there. What should sport be? What should football be? And ultimately about enjoyment for the people and recreation and bringing some perhaps entertainment within your local community, perhaps far away from some of the geopolitics and the bigger things at play. And we haven't mentioned FIFA yet, but we can't get away from the fact FIFA and Saudi Arabia is this big ongoing issue. How did the World Cup end up in Saudi Arabia in 2034? Perhaps FIFA might prefer the conversation moves on, or we stick by their insistence it isn't a fully open process that has led to this, but the number of questions are now the financial flow into FIFA raises further questions. So, Martyn, you've uncovered something about a looming FIFA sponsorship.
Yeah, Aramco, the most profitable company in the world. Profits last year, £161 billion. Already so heavily involved in sports sponsorship, ICC cricket, Formula One, women's golf, Indian Premier League, and now it's going to be a FIFA sponsor. Perhaps many people would say not surprisingly, because when you've got the biggest company in Saudi Arabia and they've got the biggest event in world sport apart from the Olympics coming to Saudi Arabia, it obviously they were going to. But I think the way a lot of people look at it is this is sort of FIFA getting a financial reward for stacking the deck in Saudi Arabia's favour.
Yeah, quite a lot to unpack. There's there's these questions as to how it ended up there, whether FIFA is upholding its post 2015 scandal of being more promises of being more transparent, more democratic. This deal looks like it was cooked up in a room of a few people and then taken to a council. We've had very few. One of the things I found quite striking: very few FAs have publicly spoken out about this. These are the members, the people who actually get to have a say, not the sponsors, not the players, not the clubs, but these very few of them. Although we've got the Norwegian FA saying they've written to FIFA asking for clarity as to how this had happened, particularly because Gianni Infantino on his Instagram said that this decision followed widespread consultation. The Norwegian FA president, Lisa Klaveness, said the first time she found out about what was happening with the 2030 and 2034 World Cups was when there was a media release. So how widespread is this consultation? Do you need to do it? And now you're in this, you can see the reason, Martyn, you've just shown that for FIFA. perhaps the biggest sponsorship? Martyn, you got a sense of how much money Aramco might spend on FIFA?
Yeah, so Ricardo Fort, the former head of sponsorship, been on this pod before, hasn't he? He's been a former head of sponsorship at Coca-Cola and Visa. He thinks will start off around $75 million a year and will sort of escalate on an annual basis up to $100 million a year, which would be the biggest sponsorship FIFA has ever had. I'm not including its partnership with EA Sports, but in terms of the sort of commercial partnership. Just to look at this sort of process, so you did a very interesting story this week, Tariq, saying that Gianni Infantino back in 2020 had sort of suggested to the Italian Prime Minister that it should go in with a joint bid with Saudi Arabia for the 2030 World Cup with Egypt. So is this? Are you sort of under the impression that Mr. Infantino was in some way sort of pitching for Saudi Arabia, partners for Saudi Arabia, that he was, even back then, he was trying to get Saudi Arabia the World Cup?
Yeah, I mean, and it's don't forget the FIFA president is the head of 211 FAs and is someone who would be treating them all equally on paper at least. So this is a meeting in September 2020, like you say, Infantino's first meeting outside of Switzerland during the COVID pandemic. You remember the world was closed down, everyone wearing masks. He went to Italy, the place that he identifies with, where his parents are from, met the Italian Prime Minister at the time, Giuseppe Conte, with the FA president of Italy, Mr. Gravina. And there were comments after and said, look, they were there to talk about COVID relief, FIFA's fund to help nations out of financial crisis as a result of COVID. But he didn't say one of the things that the Italians remember him bringing up. It was Gianni Infantino, according to Italian Prime Minister Conte and his advisor at the time, talked to, brought up this idea that Saudi Arabia and Egypt, a Saudi-led bid with Egypt, looking for a European partner in Italy, could be it. And that I found that, I don't know, kind of strange. Is that what the FIFA president should be doing? FIFA have said, to be clear, that Gianni Infantino never instigated any of these talks, but they never said he didn't bring it up in that meeting. He also talked to the Greeks after the Italians said no. In this post-Khashoggi environment, Italy didn't want anything to do that. Plus, a student had been murdered in Egypt, and that murder was unresolved. And Italy and Egypt, those relations aren't great. But Gianni Infantino was there. So, yeah, is that the role of the FIFA president?
Well, I'd heard just a few weeks after the UN General Assembly in 2021 that Gianni Infantino in that September had raised in a meeting with the Greek Prime Minister, as you've referenced, about potentially joining up with this bid with Saudi Arabia and Egypt. If I remember rightly at the time, did look into it. The Greeks were trying to deny it and insisted they knew nothing about it. But journalistically, this might be one of those interesting ones as you've uncovered with the Italians, that actually so few people know about it, that those denying it or attempting to aren't actually in the know at all.
Yeah. And that's interesting, isn't it? So this idea that you're going to find this part for what should be an open and transparent bidding competition. Again, I asked FIFA about this, and they said they didn't deny he's having these talks. They said Gianni Infantino, what he wanted or what FIFA wants are many countries competing for its best events. But look what's happened. We've only got two bidders. One for 2030, which is those 6 countries. We've talked about that in the past. So the 3 South Americans, Portugal, Spain, Morocco, and just Saudi Arabia for 2034. How is that a bidding process?
Could it be thinking at a time of COVID that the world's in turmoil, countries are in financial turmoil as well, the fact they might be deterred from bidding? Because we only have to look at this week, the Commonwealth Games Federation has been meeting, trying to ask people to bid for the 2026 games in Australia. So you've got some events that no one seems to want, and you've got some organisations.
With respect, the Commonwealth Games is not the FIFA World Cup. People will be crawling over broken glass to bring the FIFA World Cup to their country, COVID or no COVID.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I mean, I think perhaps, was it ever last with international sports leaders? I mean, we've now got the situation with the Olympics where basically the IOC president has decided that the Brisbane's going to is host of 2032 Olympics, and his body language and other language seems to suggest that he wants India to have the 2036 Olympics. So I think, look back to Sepp Blatter. I mean, he's come out quite openly, brazenly, said that his whole idea was that 2018 was going to be in Russia and 2022 was going to be in the USA, and then Platini ruined all that, deciding he was going to support Qatar. So clearly, presidents of FIFA, IOC, whatever big sports events, they have their idea where they want this to go, and sometimes they're unsuccessful, like Sepp Blatter was. But it looks like more and more they're not going to leave that to chance. They're going to sort of, international sports are going to decide themselves rather than leave it up to the members.
And it was a Gulf nation that missed out on the Olympics in 2032 as a result of this, because Qatar was interested and it got brushed aside by Brisbane. So it's not always that we're sort of focusing on how the Gulf power delivers events. They were the ones who managed to miss out. But this Saudi process, and one of the things is, and FIFA do say Infantino has been talking around the world. He was doing a media huddle I saw in the last week somewhere, but he's not faced perhaps those who are most interested in the governance and how these things are being run. So these questions are left unanswered, which just drags out the issues over how the process has been operated.
Right. So there's been no press conference after FIFA council meetings, and to bring Sepp Blatter up, whatever he did, whatever people think of him, there was always a chance to have those press conferences. Some of them were quite good YouTube fodder. So if you're there and you want to click on YouTube and see our friend Matt Scott's a legendary confrontation with Sepp Blatter, I think in 2011, that's there. But just to go back to
let me just say what that was. That was where Sepp Blatter intervened when Matt Scott shouted a question out saying, "This is the house of FIFA."
That's right.
This is not a bazaar.
This is not a bazaar. Yeah, it was.
But of course, as we saw this week, as I say, Joe Biden at a meeting with the Chinese presidency, reporters do shout out questions if you're not
right.
believing.
Reporters are in the room. Can we just go back to Ziegs mentioned the IOC and all of this stuff, but let's just remember, just for 1 second, I think we forget things really quickly. Why did Gianni Infantino become the FIFA president? Does anyone remember? We all forgotten what happened. He's not supposed to be the FIFA president, is he? What happened was that the FIFA leadership, almost the top brass, all of it almost, was kind of indicted and shipped off to a jail cell in New York. Sepp Blatter ends up collapsing, and his presidency ends up collapsing, and he's out. And this guy, this white knight, appears that few people had heard of, who'd taken part, let's not forget, in a reform program. And those documents, I believe, are still on FIFA's website. His name is signed to it, among a dozen others, to show how FIFA will be this new, open, transparent organization. So I don't want to talk about the IOC. I want to talk about FIFA and his FIFA, because he's supposed to be running a transparent organization with new and better governance. What happened with Saudi Arabia was not transparent, was not particularly democratic. It seems to have been done in a cloak and dagger circumstance. So has FIFA improved?
And let's just remember how the path opened up for Gianni Infantino. It was all due to be Michel Platini's presidency. It was all set up for him after Sepp Blatter announced he was handing down his mandate, we're thinking his official words. But then, out of nowhere, came the discovery about the Platini Blatter payments, which took Platini out of things.
Yeah, that's right. And Infantino had been the General Secretary of UEFA, and he suddenly emerges as the big rival to Sheikh Salman, the AFC president, who's still there. And together they seem to have delivered the World Cup to Saudi Arabia in 2034.
Well, I feel it's something that will be returned to quite often, and it remains under scrutiny. While those questions are unanswered, the FIFA communications department has been writing quite a few letters to the media. One of them sent to the Times pointing out that Gianni Infantino, who was democratically elected, has changed FIFA from a toxic institution to a respected, trusted and modern governing body. There we go. FIFA emphasising that their leader is democratically elected.
I guess if you say something enough times and time passes, it just becomes, which is what this effort seems to be like. It just becomes, okay, well, it must be better. It's all of these things they say. But I would urge people to look at that reform document that Gianni Infantino was part of the committee. Look at what it says and look at the state of FIFA and how it's governed now and see if those two things are aligned. And if not, you have to ask why and who is responsible for that.
Yeah, I think it's fair to point out that, yes, back in 2010, half the FIFA Executive Committee were getting paid millions and millions of dollars in bribes, either to vote for World Cup hosts or to for TV deals. So you do not have a situation, as far as we know, where the FIFA Council is like that at all now. However, that does not justify going against the reform process which has come in. And I think that's the important distinction to make.
So many more questions about that process, and you can always just send your questions into us, as we had from Brunei this week. So many of you listening from around the world, you can message us on Sport Unlocked on X, Facebook, Instagram, or sportunlockedpod@gmail.com.
Very good.
Thank you for listening, and goodbye for now.